Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Marshall Debris Hall and our colloquium this evening. It's great to see such a full room of people here to share in the wisdom that our friend Alan is going to talk about this evening. My name's Anne Sherman. I'm the dean here at the faculty, and really pleased to see so many people here for our 5th annual Ottilia Chareka Memorial Lecture. Ottilia started her education career in her home country of Zimbabwe, and came here about 25 years ago now with a teaching certificate already, but typical Canada, she had to upgrade and do her diploma in advanced undergrad studies. And I was a lucky enough person to be here at the same time doing my master's. So I met Ottilia at that time. Later, she went on to finish her master's and her PhD here. And just as she was finishing, I was happened to be working at another university as the head of that school. And I ran into Alan and Ottilia at CSSE, and Alan said, "Oh, if you're looking for someone to teach about these various things, you really should interview Ottilia." I was delighted to see her and to see that she had finished her PhD. And so we did in fact hire her. She went through the competition, was an outstanding candidate. She moved on to my street, and so we were neighbors again. And I got to know her and her 5 daughters very well. And when I left there, she was still teaching, and I would go back to visit and have time to catch up with her. Needless to say, we were all absolutely shattered when 5 years ago her life was taken in an act of spousal violence. And she had spent her life working to support women. As this indicates, she was the first woman from her village community to get a university degree, to get a master's, to get a PhD, and she sent money home regularly to clothe people, to put shoes on their feet, to school them. And I remember talking to her oldest daughter, Missy, at the time of Ottilia's passing, and she said, there will be no more shoes at home. There will be no new clothes at home because of Mom. And and people don't, when you're walking to school 6 or 7 kilometers, to not have shoes is a huge challenge. But that was Ottilia, and she worked on First Nations first education, or Bachelor of Education degree. She worked on programs for African Nova Scotians, where she was working at St. X, and she just had a remarkable impact on everybody whom she met. And so I think it's very fitting that we hold this lecture each year to celebrate her life and to think about the kind of work that she completed herself and that she would want us to carry on with. Remarkably, even though this is the 5th one, I have to sit down now, my good leg's given out, sorry. We've never had Alan give the Ottilia Chareka Memorial Lecture. Alan was her PhD supervisor. Alan is a remarkable scholar, not just known provincially, but nationally and internationally for his work in things like democracy education, history education, citizenship education, and he was an amazing mentor to Ottilia. And we're honored to work with him here at UNB. I am forever grateful to him because he put my name forward to be the dean here, and it's the best possible move I've ever been able to make, and my life is so much better because of it, Alan. Thank you. And so he's a star in my mind and my heart, and I'm delighted that he is willing to do this presentation for us tonight. And he'll talk about Ottilia, about some of his work, and about some of the kinds of issues that we must remain vigilant about, and that what Ottilia would want us to remain vigilant about. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Sears.
I didn't put her name forward so that her life would be better. I put it forward so that my life would be better. And if any of my colleagues are upset with me about that, I guess that's too bad. Thank you all for coming. I'll give you a quick look at the title of my talk before moving on to talk a little bit about Ottilia and some other folks. It's no accident that I haven't given this lecture before. I've been reluctant to give it. I've been the organizer for giving it, and one of the reasons is at this point in the evening I'm supposed to say wonderful and profound things about Ottilia, and I've been racking my brains to say something that would do her justice, and I can't do it. I first met Ottilia in 1993 when she was first here, and I came home at that year from working on my own PhD at UBC, and I met Ottilia, who had been here for a couple of years before that, just finished her DAWs, and said, "I've heard about you, and you're going to be my master's supervisor." And so I was. And that was kind of our relationship. I was called the supervisor, and I never got to supervise anything, I think. Ottilia was a force of nature. And she was important to our family. She was important to me. Not only was she my master's and PhD student, we collaborated in all the years following that. We were working on a project together when she died. So I miss her a lot. And I wouldn't be here tonight, not just because this is her lecture, I wouldn't be talking about these things tonight, except for her. One of the greatest privileges, I'm thinking a lot about this lately, one of the greatest privileges of being a teacher is having students. And my students have shaped me so much. Every year, undergraduate, graduate students push me to think about new things in new ways. And Ottilia, I wasn't particularly interested in diversity. I was going to leave that for all those other people to do. And I was interested in, I study how people think about key ideas related to citizenship. So I was interested in how they thought about dissent, and how they thought about democratic participation, and how they thought about human rights. And I was going to leave, they're not unrelated to diversity, but I was going to leave that. And then Ottilia came along. And I put this picture up there for two reasons. Number one, it's quintessential Ottilia. She told the joke to make it laugh. I'm holding the camera in this picture. I'm the one with the camera. And she told the joke. And three of the women in this picture, and I don't disparage the fourth, I just don't know her very well. Ottilia and two of the other women in this picture have influenced my thinking about human rights, diversity, and social justice, and I want to acknowledge them tonight too. The one beside Ottilia is Carla Peck, and much of the research I'll talk about tonight I've done with Carla, starting with her master's degree and on to her own PhD, which she did at UBC and following. And the one on the your far right is my daughter Rebecca, who, I know there's some teachers here tonight, and I want to tell you that Rebecca was fired up in grade 2 by a teacher who introduced her to a little Japanese girl who contracted cancer and made paper cranes. Contracted cancer as a result of the Hiroshima bomb and made paper cranes. And then another teacher introduced her to Ruby Bridges, and another one to Martin Luther King, and another little group from this place, from Marie Cashin's class, had gone out to her middle school to do stuff on enrichment with kids, and they did a unit on the Holocaust. And all of these things built a passion for human rights and social justice in Rebecca, who has gone on to live that out largely, and she has been a big influence on my life as well. And finally, there's so many people I could talk about who are the reason I'm here, but in the last couple of years, some of the work I'm going to talk about tonight I've been doing with my new colleague Lyle Ham, who's sitting over there. And Lyle showed up from Brooks, Alberta, interested in diversity and diversity education and the way schools deal with changing demographics. And so we've collaborated a lot together. So you know what they say, that if you steal from one person it's plagiarism, but if you steal from many it's research. So I'm here to talk to you about my research tonight. I have written lots of papers alone, I've given lots of talks alone, or written lots of papers with only my name on it, and I've given lots of talks with only my name on them, but I've never done anything alone in academic life. And so there's lots of people here I could acknowledge, but I did want to start by acknowledging those. And I also want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting tonight on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqey people, and we're thankful that we share UNB with them and our colleagues here at the Mi'kmaq Wolastoqey Institute. So let's get started. I forgot. I always skip this every year. I wrote the poster. When we started this thing, I wrote the poster. And I don't like to talk about how Ottilia died. And so we use euphemisms, like she died tragically. And said how she died tonight. She was murdered. And I don't think it's a good idea I don't want to talk about it, but I don't think it's a good idea to skip it. And that's been brought home to me in several ways lately. And one way is my colleagues here have been organizing this Red Shawl campaign over the last week, and it is part of the national commemoration for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And we know we have a national inquiry about murdered and missing Indigenous girls. And the other headline up there, I don't know if you have been as shocked as I have been about the appalling lack of knowledge displayed by some judges in Canada about what sexual assault is, and in fact appalling lack of knowledge about the law. But I have, and I couldn't bring myself to put a headline up there about the current American election campaign, but that's also brought home the truth that violence against women is a pervasive part of our society. We need to talk about it. We need to work to stop it. And that's part of the reason this lecture goes on. So, now we'll get started. With Dr. Kelly Leach. I'm sure you've been paying attention to the news lately, and Dr. Leach is running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, and she has decided to make a key focus of her platform for that leadership the assessment or the judging of immigrants and refugees to Canada based on their adherence to Canadian values, which she states here in the negative. But I want to say I would affirm the positive aspects of these values, but I want to. Kelly Leach wants us to have a conversation, so I think we should have we should talk about Canadian values, what they are, how they're manifest, who holds them, right? And there's been lots of things that have happened in the last number of years to bring these to the forefront. You will remember Zunera Ishak's desire to take her citizenship oath wearing her niqab, and the controversy that sparked during the election campaign. And the Prime Minister said that that was anti-Canadian or un-Canadian. And the current Prime Minister, who then was a leader of the third party, gave a speech at McGill where he said that the Prime Minister's views were akin to the St. Louis or the none is too many policy that we had. So there was a huge debate about this kind of thing. To the rest of Canada, a much more mundane example that we know about here in New Brunswick, we're currently fighting about who gets to take which school bus. And can young French and English New Brunswickers, should young French and English New Brunswickers take the same school bus? And finally, Canada has regular issues around the relationship between settler and Indigenous populations, and particularly the relationship around the land. What are we going to do with the land and the resources that flow from it? Who owns them? Who should use them? Who should control them? These are all questions. These are just three examples of ongoing issues in Canada. They may not persist, but they are illustrative of what Will Kim Lickus calls the three kinds of minorities in Canada. He talks about polyethnic or immigrant minorities, about national minorities. The French in Canada would be an example of that, of a national minority as well as First Nations. And he talks about Indigenous or Aboriginal minorities. And in Canada, we have different legal frameworks. All of those minorities are recognized in Canadian law, in fact, recognized in the Canadian Constitution. And all of them have different legal and policy frameworks about them, so it's important that we talk about all of these things. So, I don't oppose. You know, when we try to talk about it, I have some sympathy for Kelly Leach. This cartoon appeared in the Globe and Mail a day or two after she made her first pronouncement. And the way to clear the room is to say you're going to talk about Canadian values, and nobody wants to talk about that. And some of my undergraduate students are here tonight. I'm thank them for coming. I hope they didn't feel strong-armed into it, but they today, their assignment for today's class, they led a controversial issues discussion, and there's some old folks here that used to have me years ago, and they've done this before. And when that comes up, when these kinds of things come up, they say, we would prefer not to do that as teachers, right? And especially if those things are around ethno-cultural values. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We don't want to say anything that causes somebody to have pain. And we also don't want to be the center of controversy ourselves. I think maybe the second one sometimes is more important than the first for them, but anyway. So I'm going to make some central assertions tonight. 3 central assertions. Number one is that ethno-cultural diversity is not a problem to be solved, but an enduring and complex element of our civic context. And by this, I don't mean there are no... I gave a talk similar to this in Montreal Friday, and I got an email back from somebody afterwards that said, you said ethno-cultural diversity was not a problem, and yet you had all these... my argument here is not that issues don't arise because of diversity in a society. It's not only ethno-cultural diversity, by the way. There's lots of kinds of diversity that cause us to talk together civically. But it isn't going away, folks. It's not something we're going to put behind us. If you think ethno-cultural diversity is something you're going to put behind you, you're an assimilationist. And most of you don't want to think about yourselves that way. So if you think about it, this is part of our enduring it always has been. Education for and about diversity in Canada has been most often been passive, tame, and about conflict management. We don't want conflict in our classrooms. And so we cover it up, we bury it in a number of different ways. And finally, we need a much more robust and, if you like, dangerous approach to teaching about diversity. Those are the arguments I'm going to make tonight. We'll see how well we get. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but the elements of cultural diversity as a problem show up in some of the research that my colleagues and I have done. One of the things we hear, we've been interviewing teachers and students across Canada. And one of the things we hear often, just in the way people respond, is that diversity is a new thing, and it's a new thing related to immigration and migration. And I think that's an inherent underlying assumption of Kelly Leach's whole program. Now we have a problem because we have all these people coming into our country, and so we better screen them so they fit in well, right? But we hear that in much more, not nasty ways or benign ways. But we hear from people, well, they've come here and we have a set of there's lots of we and our talk. We have a way of doing things, and they bring their ways of doing things, and so it's all new. The second thing we hear is that cultural identity is like an adornment. It's like a piece of jewelry. It's something you can put on and take off easily. And I don't think that's restricted, by the way, to the young people and the teachers that we interview. I think that's the inherent idea behind the Charter of Secular Values that was put forward by the Parti Québécois government in Quebec. The idea that, well, I heard lots of people make the argument, if you want to wear your hijab at home, you wear your hijab at home. But when you come to the public workplace, take it off. And I think that displays a real lack of understanding about what some of these cultural symbols that people adorn themselves with mean, and how deep their sense of cultural and religious identity is. I guess I'm not going to force anybody into particular policy positions tonight, or not going to argue for particular policy positions, but what I would argue with is a deep sense of empathy for what it means for someone to have to take something like that off. The second is that diversity is foreign, that it comes from away and it is posed on us. That's related to number one, or third one I mean. Fourth is that identity is fixed and singular. And as said, I've spent my life doing research on citizenship education, and for most of Canada's history, the purpose of citizenship education has been to create a unified, single sense of Canadian identity. Public schools, were created for two reasons. This is a blunt hammer, but I think it's an accurate one. Number one is to prepare workers for the industrial economy, and number two, to separate people from tribe, from ethnic group, from tribe, from family, and create a unified sense of citizenship. And for most of Canadian history, there's been the assumption that people can only hold one identity, and so we better make it a Canadian identity. And that, I say for most of Canadian history, sometimes the history of this is told in a linear fashion. I would liken it much more to a symphony with rising and fading themes, like the 1812 overture. You know, in the French, the Tchaikovsky, as the French invade Russia, you hear the Marseillaise compounding through over top of the Russian pastoral and liturgical music. And then there's the big booming in the middle at Borodino, and then the Russian music starts to come to the ascension. But the French music is always there, the Russian music is always there, and you'll see this in the history of social studies and education in Canada. Still lots of people who would say the purpose of history education in Canada is to teach people to love their country. And anyone who holds that as a purpose is a propagandist, not an educator, in my view. But, so, the truth is, well, the research shows clearly that young people can hold very cosmopolitan and complex identities, and without much difficulty. The other assumption that you see is that there's a natural movement to the secular or the neutral. There's a great belief among teachers of liberal neutrality that my job in the classroom, and my students all led controversial issues today, and I'd be interested to follow up, but there's lots of research that shows teachers think their job is to make sure everybody's opinion gets out on the table and gets discussed and talked about, but we don't have to come to any decisions. Everybody can just kind of hold their own, right? There's this notion of, my job is to stand back and be neutral. I'm not going to go into these assumptions in great detail, but I did want to follow up on a couple. And the first of the two, that one is that issues around diversity are recent, and that they're foreign. So I thought nobody better to quote than Lord Durham, who shows up here in about 1838 after the rebellions in the middle of the 1830s to try to settle things. And what he says is, I thought I was going to find a problem with government when I find our two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. My wife's doing a history of racism course now, and Lord Durham calls them races. I doubt we'd call the French and the English different races nowadays, but that's the language of Lord Durham. And Lord Durham had a solution. Get rid of one of those nations. Assimilate the French. He forgot, by the way, there were several other nations here in the same territory. Just to point out that Lord Durham missed that. Another example, I'm on a book prize jury this year, and for a best book in the history of education. And one of the books I read was this one. Fascinating, because I grew up in Montreal, so it was kind of like going home, right? But you'll notice the title of the book and the subtitle, Honorary Protestants, the Jewish School Question in Montreal from 1867 to 1997. 1867, just by the way, is when the country started as a nation state, so this is not new. And he actually, the book deals with the question from 1808 forward, but he starts in 1867 because there was a particular constitutional arrangement that put the Jews in Montreal in an awkward position. And that constitutional arrangement was they didn't have linguistic schools in Quebec. The Constitution, the BNA Act, said they had religious schools, Protestant and Catholic. And so for the years of Canada, this Jewish population is really interesting. You know, you'll find in some of Montreal areas of Montreal, and particularly some of the suburbs of Montreal, like NDG and other places, you'll find 70, 80, 90% in some cases of the school population is Jewish, and Jewish parents cannot vote for school board members or run for school board members because they are Protestant schools. Right? And you'll find that in many of these years the same percentage of the tax money is coming from Jewish families, but they don't have any say about how the schools are being run. Right? The other point, important point in the quote there is that civic life goes on a number of levels, right? So this happened, these things were worked out and worked on in the courts. They were worked out and worked on by lobbying government officials in the halls of politics, and they were worked on and worked out in private negotiations between and among cultural communities. And for citizenship, for competent citizenship, citizens need to be able to work at all of those domains. My own preference is to see us working much more in that last one. The Bouchard-Tremblay Commission in Quebec a few years ago on reasonable accommodation talked about the difference between the kind of litigation approach and what they called the citizen approach. And the citizen approach was to help people and communities work on negotiating these issues together, rather than resorting to the courts, because in many cases the courts are a pretty blunt instrument, especially when they're trying to parse religious doctrine. They do a really bad job at it, right? So this is not new. This is not new, and it's not foreign. Diversity has existed in Canada. Well, there was diversity here long before Europeans showed up, and there's been diversity as long as Europeans have shown up. I don't know if you know, but in this part of the world, people of African descent showed up with the Loyalists. As a political entity, what we now call New Brunswick, this province was formed by the Loyalists in migration in 1783 and 84, and with them came all kinds of people. People of African descent in Fredericton are not new. In 1861 in British Columbia, there were 7,000 people of Chinese descent. And just to put that in context, in 1871, 10 years later, when British Columbia joined Confederation, there were only 12,000 people of European descent. So the Chinese made up a significant portion of the British Columbia. So the ethnic diversity in Canada is not new, and it is not foreign. It's part of who we are and what we are since before peoples from Europe or Africa or Asia or South America began to immigrate here. These are some of the kinds of questions that were inherent in the things I showed you at the beginning. These are the kinds of questions that Canadian citizens have to wrestle with. What are reasonable accommodations for diversity? How are the rights of different kinds of minoritized groups enshrined in law in Canada? Are these rights adequate and adequately protected? How should we enact constitutional guarantees of minority language education rights? Do people need a separate school bus? How do we balance fiscal responsibility and rights to educational services? What does it mean to be treaty people? How can we build positive relationships between Indigenous peoples and settler populations? You have to worry about these questions. If you're a teacher, the kids in your class have to worry about these questions. And in case you haven't noticed, we're not doing very well. People often say that social studies education is about teaching people how to get along. I think we need to flip that upside down. Good social education teaches people how to not get along. We aren't ever going to agree on all these questions. I know of no important public policy decision that has satisfied everyone or lasted for all time. Like, we got to talk. And we have to learn to talk together when we disagree. So, in what ways does our diversity education? Claim number 2. So, ethno-cultural diversity is part of our civic context. We need to learn to wrestle with these questions. As educators, we need to help the people in our classes learn to wrestle with these questions. So, how is it been tamed? Well, we often ignore it, or we do it sporadically. What we find from teachers interviewing them across Canada is they'll often do diversity when there's an obvious case of it in their classroom. Oh, we had immigrants from Syria, let's pick one, last year, so we talked about Syria, or we had a Chinese family. We need to think about what that does to the people that are being identified as kind of targets and spokespeople for everything. And the second thing, we need to think about how kind of unsystematic and non-comprehensive that is. Right? We did interviews in this city with middle school students, almost none of whom, Lyle and I did these interviews, almost none of whom recognized the words Maliseet, First Nation, or Aboriginal. Almost none of them. In the schools where we were doing the interviews, there were students who were Malafite, realistically. So we haven't been doing this. It's in the curriculum. We haven't been doing it. My line for my students is, you can't use the F words in multicultural education. Food, fun, and festivals. I'm at the point now where I wish we were doing it, because we show, when somebody asked me on Friday when I did this, what are you talking to middle school kids? You go in and ask them what they think about ethnic diversity? That's exactly what we do. We go in and say, well, tell me what you think about ethnic diversity. No, we don't do that. We actually show them prompts or storyboards that push them into areas to think about ethnic diversity. And we have a number of storyboards related to food, fun, and festivals. One of them is that we're going to change the school holiday system. So we're not only going to have holidays at Christmas and Easter and other Christian things, we're going to include Ramadan or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or you name it, right? What do you think about that? You're not going to have any more holidays, so kids immediately think, oh yeah, okay, cool. We'll be off half the year. No, you're not going to have any more, but we want other groups to feel that their days are recognized in the school calendar. One of the huge issues in Montreal, by the way, with the Jewish school question. You got a school where it's 90% Jewish. They won't close it on Yom Kippur. So you come to school, there are 6 kids in the school, right? It was just crazy, some of the stuff. Anyway, this is a real question, and the kids don't recognize any of these things, right? I'm not going to go on too much about that. The diminishment of difference, we see this all the time. People are people. We hear this a lot from teachers. What we need to do is find out what we have in common and teach to what we have in common. I get that people human beings share common needs, common aspirations, lots of things in common, but we are also very different. And I think this comes from a fear of that difference. There's a focus on conflict management and avoidance of anything controversial. That's why when Kelly Leach makes that proclamation, the next scene is everybody cleared out of the town square. We don't want to, what do you don't talk about? Religion and politics. Diversity and politics, right? Don't want to talk about those things. There's a great faith in a depoliticized liberal neutrality, including the teacher as neutral arbiter. I'm going to spend a few minutes on some of these things. I want to give you an example of ignored, how we ignore it. Sometimes we actually deal with it, but we deal it differently with different kids. So in Ontario, at high school, you have an applied stream and you have an academic stream. And all the kids take the same compulsory courses, but they have very different outcomes. So here's an outcome from grade 9 geography for the same unit for applied and academic. You notice the difference? We're asking the academic kids to deal with critical and political questions. What are the political implications of different ideas and beliefs about the value of Canada's natural environment, and explain how these ideas and beliefs affect the use and protection of Canada's natural resources? And the other one is quite concrete and functional. What natural disasters happen here? Big difference. In the curriculum, these get elaborated with questions that the teachers can explore, sample questions the teacher can explore with the kids. Let me give you a sample of the questions from the academic one for this outcome. How does the traditional ecological knowledge of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people influence their beliefs about the natural environment and its importance to them? Is there a current issue that highlights conflicting beliefs about the value of Canada's natural environment and how it should be protected? Like the pipeline one I showed you before. What actions and processes are occurring in order to resolve the conflict? What is the difference between the preservation or conservation park system? How might the opening of the Northwest Passage, very relevant after what happened this summer in the north, how might the opening of the Northwest Passage affect Canada's claim to Arctic sovereignty? On and on and on. Here are the questions for the applied thing. What are some of the social, political, environmental, and economic impacts of the tornado that hit Goderich in 2011? What are some typical impacts of ice storms on communities in southern Ontario and Quebec? How does heavy flooding like along the Red River in 2011 affect communities? They don't ask them about anything political in that whole course. In the applied thing, there is no mention of Aboriginal people, Inuit or Métis, First Nations. So in other words, we know that's a critical question Canadian citizens have to wrestle with, and we think the only people that get to wrestle with it are people in academic programs. And we do that all the time in schools. I hear teachers talk about, oh, that's the core class. Those are my level 3s. They can't do that. If you doubt like that, shame on you. If you don't include those, you don't think the people that are going to be dressing your hair or fixing your car or building your house, you don't think they need to wrestle with Canadian citizenship issues? They sure do. And not only do they need to, they're interested. They want to. And we deny them an education all the time. That's just one sample of a number from that curriculum, and that happens all the time, everywhere. We know that solidly from research. That shouldn't happen. That's one way to ignore it. Oh, it's there. We talk about all these critical issues in the Ontario curriculum, but we only talk about them with some kids. And it's inadequate. In terms of diversity, what difference? These are the kinds of things we hear from students and teachers. People are people. Find the commonalities and work towards getting better collectively, not staying the same individually. Because the non-Aboriginals, this is a student in response to a prompt about fishing rights, a story about a dispute about fishing lobster. Everybody should have the same rights. We're all the same. Nobody should be treated differently. Very few. Some of the kids actually recognize. They don't often talk about treaty rights, but they'll say things like, well, they were here first, and they were fishing lobster. We kind of moved in on them, so maybe they should be able to. So they've got a nascent idea. That happens. That comes up sometimes. Far more common to see something like this. We see it over and over again. No recognition, by the way, of lots of teachers talk to us about their experience being a minority. They worked in a First Nations community. They visited a place where they were visibly different. But no recognition of power differentials, of the privilege that they take with them into that context. I worked in Africa, in a village, a very poor village in northeast Kenya. I went there in 1981 largely because I had Western guilt about how rich I was. So I gave up a job that paid me $30,000 a year to take a job that paid me $3,000 a year, and I said my guilt will be gone. And I moved to this village, and the good thing about it was there were lots of people in the village, poorer than I was, but there were lots of people richer than I was, and financially. There were lots of shop owners or traders or anybody else that had a lot more money than we did. But you know what? I had a Canadian passport. I lived in a very dangerous area of the world, and if it went to hell in a handbasket, people were going to come and try to get me out. I had a great level of privilege that I didn't recognize at the time. In terms of diversity education, Kathy Bickmore, no one better in Canada to write about this. You want to hear somebody talk about how diversity education and conflict management. Kathy Bickmore at the University of Toronto studied curricula across the country and practiced across the country and developed this kind of typology. And she said, we're stuck here. This is what we do in schools most of the time. When we do anything, it's kind of food, fun, and festivals. Let's appreciate one another. Now, I don't want to minimize that. Getting to know people's cultural backgrounds, appreciating cultural expression, I don't have any difficulty with that. It's a great place to begin. It's just a lousy place to end. It's not sufficient. For her, what she sees happening in classrooms is social control. It's the covering up of difference, not the opening up of difference. She talks, I stole her word, the idea of dangerous approaches. She talks about dangerous citizenship. She writes about it. The idea we're opening this up. This will not be easy. I don't want to pretend that it will. It will be hard. But we need to go there. And we can go there. Well, this one drives me around the bend. Drives me around the bend. Angela MacDonald, we see this in our work all the time, but Angela MacDonald did a PhD thesis at the University of Toronto about 3 years ago, and I was her external examiner, and she interviewed a number of science and social studies teachers from Alberta about how they dealt with controversial issues in the classroom. And one of the questions she asked them was how their own cultural position, their own views, impacted their teaching of this. And over and over and over and over again, they said, thank goodness I'm not a religious person, and I can treat this in a balanced way. And, well, I am a person who practices a faith. So what they were saying about me is I can't teach any of this stuff because I'm going to impose my religious values. I'm going to ram them down your throat if you're in my classroom. There is no such thing as neutrality. Everyone comes from a position. I'm going to talk about this more in a few minutes. And I think religious teachers are as likely to be good at standing back and managing a thing. But if you think you're coming from no position, you're wrong. In France, they have this policy framework called laïcité, and you see it come up in Quebec as well. That's the policy framework that says don't wear overt religious symbols in schools and other public institutions. That's the one that says don't wear your bikini on the beach. That's the one that says secularism is neutral, and that is a load of horse manure. Secularism is a position. I would have an argument with you that it's a religious position. It answers all the ultimate questions. Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? What is the appropriate relationship between men and women, adults and children, seniors and younger people? All of those big, basic questions secularism answers from a perspective, just like religions do. It's not neutral. So teachers, not that you don't want to present things in a balanced way. Not that you don't want to have alternative points of view on the table. I'm not arguing against balance. Don't be so naive as to think you don't come from a position, that your classroom isn't structured like to reflect a position. Now, something I want to make very clear. I'm not here to bash teachers. I'm very much here to bash school systems. I want to make that clear too. So, we're not doing a good job at teaching about diversity in New Brunswick and in most places in Canada. That's clear. I don't blame teachers. These things, we have given teachers in this country an unfunded mandate in this area. And by that I mean we have high curriculum standards. Grade 1, you and your world. It's a pretty crappy curriculum for social studies. But in grade 1, we say that children should know who the indigenous peoples that are native to this region are, and a whole list of things about how they think and operate and how they've interacted with the land. In grade 1. So we set high standards. And we give teachers very little educational background before they go into the classroom. We give them poor curricula. We prioritize math and science. Folks, I've had people tell me it's not rocket science, it's just social studies. This is way harder than rocket science. Chemical A, chemical B, projectile C. Light it up, it's doing the same thing 9,999 times out of 10,000. This is messy. It won't do the same thing twice. You want to handle this? You want to wrestle with this in the classroom? Give me rocket science any day. I'm not going to have somebody outside with a picket sign saying I've done something wrong. This is important. But we send people out to do it with very little background. We often misassign people to teach in social studies classes who don't have social studies background, and that's just wrong. We produce really poor materials that don't look at things from different perspectives, and then we expect teachers to handle this mandate. We have teachers tell us over and over again, I've been in this profession 25 years, I've never seen a single PD session organized on this theme. So I just wanted to make that clear. Things aren't good. So how do we move? The more dangerous diversity education I want to talk about inducts all citizens into a complex, contested, and fluent discussion of diversity. Teachers become reflexively aware of their own position and trying to negotiate that as they teach. We avoid the big sort. We teach not only history, but how history works. And we foster cultural and religious literacy. I'm only going to talk about religious because nobody argues about cultural, but we run from religion like crazy. So we're back to Kelly Leach. She says we should have a conversation. I want to tell you, we've been having one. Since the first person from this group met the first person from that group, we've been having these conversations. And we not only have been having these conversations, we've been having them about immigrant groups. So put yourself in I was born in 1954. I came of age in the early 1960s. I thought there was nothing in this country that didn't have to do with national unity questions. Bilingualism, Quebec and the rest of Canada. In 1970, I lived on the same street as Premier Barrasa's sister when the October crisis broke out. I had to pass a military checkpoint to go to school. This was the focus of the country. When I went to do my PhD thesis, I studied the federal government involvement in citizenship education from 1940 to 1982, and I found out that the words bilingualism and biculturalism don't even appear in an annual report of the Department of Secretary of State until 1962. You mean there was a time before this? There was. In the early 1960s, the Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, sets up the B&B Commission, Bilingualism and Biculturalism. In 1968, they begin reporting. They laid out 6 volumes of their report. In 1969, the Official Languages Act is passed, making Canada federally a bilingual country. In 1970, the bilingualism in education legislation, the first legislation is passed, and they set up French immersion for the first time. My brother was in the first French immersion class in Canada. And lots of people didn't like it. So the federal government said they better like it, and we better make sure we only bring immigrants into this country who like it. So Kelly Leach, get in line. People have been saying this for a long time, right? Not only that, the problem was not only immigrants. I found this report in the archives, and really nice. It's always nice when they staple something to it. So a senior person, I don't know who it was, because I know it was senior because this was a document going to the cabinet for approval. So it's getting circulated in the top realms of departments, as these things do, and this little memo appears attached to it. You Anglophones out there, you should get used to this too. Canada is in fact a bilingual country, and that can't be changed. That's a fact, and that's a load of horse manure. Canada has never been a bilingual country, ever. Canada has been a multilingual country since well before there was a Canada. People spoke Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey and Mohawk and Cree and English and French and Hebrew and Aramaic and Chinese and Portuguese and Italian. We are, by policy, by law, we're bilingual, yeah. Those are choices. They're political choices. But you see the way this is constructed? This is like Kelly Leach. That's my problem with her thing. I don't have a problem talking about Canadian values. I have a problem when you tell me they're fixed, final, and forever. Because somebody told me that in 1970. And no one thinks that anymore. Well, maybe some do. But Kelly Leach says we should be tolerant of other cultures. That's a long-standing Canadian tradition, except when it isn't. This is an act passed unanimously by the British Columbia Legislature, and I might add, it's not an act to prevent people from voting who weren't voting. It's an act to take away voting rights from people who had already been voting. BCers woke up one day and saw too many Asian people around and thought, well, we better squelch this in the bud. So they did. This is from New Brunswick. And all those who think, you out there are thinking, you know those Acadians, those French here, they're always demanding stuff. They want the school buses, they want this, they want that, they want the other thing. Did you know, as part of the conversation that we should have, that until the 1960s, the Anglophone Department of Education in New Brunswick actively tried to squelch and rid New Brunswick of French as a public language. The Department of Education operated wholly in English until Louis Robichaud. And if you wanted to communicate with the department, they had French schools. Most of the textbooks in those French schools were French translations of English books, and many of them had the English on one side and the French on the other, so we could wean people from their language. So I'm not going to presuppose the answer to the school busing question, but something like this is an important element to bring into that. To understand why a minority population might feel vulnerable, especially in a place like Fredericton, which is a center of loyalist English New Brunswick. And I bring my children here to serve the province. And their total milieu is, that's a nice French word, isn't it? Their total milieu is English. When they play hockey, when they go to the mall, when they go to the movies, when they go on the streets. And I get to preserve school. And maybe 30 minutes on each side of school. It might be financially silly to run 2 bus systems. So I'm not presupposing the answer to that, but I am saying part of that conversation has to involve an understanding of the historical and cultural context in which this occurs. And I hear no Anglophones when they talk about this busing with any recognition of how vulnerable a minority population might feel. I purposely stayed away from residential schools because we're hearing lots about them. But it wasn't only residential schools. Ellen Fairclough, who, by the way, was a groundbreaker. She's the first female member of any federal cabinet in Canada, in John Diefenbaker's cabinet. A very progressive woman who was also superintendent of Indian Affairs. And then she made this speech to a group of school superintendents in 1959, or this is a portion of her speech. See, residential schools weren't working well enough. So maybe the idea of taking Aboriginal children away from their families and putting them in an isolated place is not the answer. Maybe the answer is immersing them in an English context with non-Aboriginal kids. For the same end, I might point out. You'll note that in this cross-cultural conversation, the non-Indigenous kids are not benefiting from the association. Only the Indigenous kids benefit from the association. Here's another part of our conversation about diversity. Ms. Leach, Dr. Leach says in her thing, we should respect people of different sexual identities. But that has been a contested and controversial and rather new thing in Canada, and here's just an example. And this is a kind of a lightning quick change in the Canadian polity from 1999 to 2005. And I might point out that the majority of people in Ms. Leach's party voted for motion number 1 and against motion number 2. Number 2 wasn't a motion, it's actually an act of parliament. Again, not to presuppose where this debate would go, but to show this is all part of this context of Canadian values. One final example. Here's an example of Canadian values. And what is this? It's the House of Commons. What values are expressed by this arrangement? Yeah. We believe in Canada. I'm not supposed to get out of. Hi, Lindsay. We believe in Canada that disputes are best settled in an adversarial fashion. We set up our parliament face to face. We stipulate a government and opposition. We seat them 2 sword lengths apart, and we separate them with a bloody big war club. They can't start to talk until we bring the war club in and we set it between them. It's adversarial. Are you disturbed by the adversarial nature of Canadian politics? Many people are sometimes. It doesn't have to be adversarial. But what you should know is it's that on purpose. So is our court system, set up exactly the same way, with a prosecutor, if you like, and a defense. And the idea is you get at truth the best by putting these positions vigorously. That's a value. It's a Canadian value. I don't think Canadians share any of these Canadian values I've shown you. All Canadians. They never do. Right? All of them are always contested. Because here's also a Canadian value in terms of how you do parliament. This is a legislature in Nunavut. It's round. People aren't face to face. No one is elected as a member of a political party. There is no premier when the election takes place until they meet in the round and arrive at consensus about who's the premier. It's consensual. It's a different model. It expresses a different value. It exists in Canada. Now, I got flack on Friday also for promoting consensual models over adversarial models, and I'm not. I know of consensual communities that have been very oppressive to individuals, where individuals have felt squelched, and the community runs over them. So it's not simple here, right? I've also been disturbed by the adversarial nature of our politics from time to time, and wished for a more consensual system. I don't think the two are necessarily antithetical to one another, but my point is that they are part of the values that we hold together. We are in a conversation. And when my daughter was in grade 8, she came down and she said, I got a test tomorrow in social studies. Ask me some questions. So first question was, what's the date of Confederation? She said July 1st, 1867. I said, I don't think you should say that. What do you mean I shouldn't say that? That's it. I said, no, I think you should see April 1st, 1949. That's not the right answer. For who here is that the date of Confederation? There's some people, there's some Newfoundlanders here. Yes, sir. That's the date of Confederation in Newfoundland. And it's 1870 if you live in Prince Edward Island, and 1871 if you live in British Columbia, and in 1905 if you live in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and 1999 if you live in Nunavut. And my point is, Confederation is not a date in time. It's not a single event or a vote of the British Parliament. It is an agreement by which we live together, and how we share power, and set up legislatures. And we've been negotiating that agreement and renegotiating for 150 years. My wife and I have been married 41 years. We've been renegotiating and negotiating that agreement too. You all know this. You've all lived with people. When you live with people, you negotiate and renegotiate. Or you go your separate ways. We've even talked about that in Canada. Not in our family. Not in our family. She's going to kill me when this goes. What I want for my daughter, what I want for my students, is that they get to enter that conversation. And so all the things that I've talked about, they're just a sample of the kinds of history that they need to know to enter that conversation. If you ever walked into the room and you're in the middle of a conversation, people are in the middle of a conversation, you don't know whatever's going on, you don't know what the heck's going on. Canada is a conversation. Our job as teachers is so that when our students enter that conversation, they know what's going on. They enter up to speed. And it goes on from here. Canada will not have the same borders it has today in 100 years. It will not. I can make that prediction with almost absolute certainty, because almost no country in the world today has the borders it had 100 years ago. We're all, it's not just us. Everybody's doing this. We need to induct people to this conversation. I'm not going to talk in this, but so when a kid knows something, when we want to teach them these things, they need to know what the key ideas or critical attributes are, how they've been manifest across time and context. How has this shown up? How has respect or lack of respect for other cultures shown up in different places in different times? How does it manifest now? What are the tensions? What are the points of disagreement? What do I think? What's my position on this? And how can I act on that in the civic space? So if you want somebody educated about this stuff, it's a complex thing. It's not spouting back a definition or telling me which days of the month that different people celebrate. It's entering into this conversation about what makes up Canada. I'm going to try to go through the left. I know I'm on a long time, so we need to be reflectively self-aware. The teachers we interviewed don't recognize they have a position, but I have felt exactly this way myself. Ethnicity is exotic. It's something other. We don't recognize that we all come from a place. And that when we don't recognize that, we are moving people to our place. We're assuming it's neutral. We're assuming that's the way everybody goes. This is again from Angela MacDonald's thesis. Same kind of thing coming up. That they were neutral and that their positions were the norm. And we see that over and over again. There's been a great podcast series put up by the Globe and Mail recently. If you don't have it, download it, called Color Code, about talking about race in Canada. They started off the way I started off. These are things we need to talk about. And they've made the point, white people don't like to talk about this stuff. And you want to know the truth? It's truth confessions time. Carla Peck, she pushed me to read the literature on whiteness, and I poo-pooed it. And then we started doing this research, and it hit me. It's true. We assume our position is neutral. We assume our position is normal. We assume that everybody is moving toward that position. And if you think about it, that's what assimilation is. Avoiding the Big Sort. Big Sort was a book written in the United States a few years ago. I don't think it's the same as here, but the idea is people are buying houses and living in neighborhoods where everybody's alike, where everybody has the same level of income, where everybody has the same religious and cultural background. And so, because schools go in catchment areas by area, you get schools that are where everybody thinks. The book, Political Classroom, they talk about like-minded schools. And the challenge for teachers in like-minded schools is twice as much as it is for teachers that aren't in like-minded schools. I was at Dawson College in Montreal on Friday speaking. What a great place to be a teacher if you want to teach in a non-like-minded place, right? You've got cosmopolitan Montreal, francophones and anglophones. They say they hear every language in the world in the hallways, so people coming from different places and different spaces into your classroom, it naturally opens up the possibility of having productive and discussions with some variance in them. When you have a like-minded classroom or school, you have to work harder to open up those discussions. I'm going to end with, I'm going to skip my religion one tonight. I'm going to end with how history works. We can talk about religion some other time. I've just written with Lindsay Harriet, a former student, a paper on connecting religion and social justice, but I do want to finish with this one. We need to teach our students history. I've already articulated that, so they can get into the conversation. They know what the conversation has been, what the ideas are, how ideas have evolved over time, and they can join the conversation. We also need to teach students how history works. What we know from research in history education is around the world, people narrate themselves. They narrate themselves, and they narrate their group. And when they narrate themselves and their group, they also narrate the other. You hear these narrations all the time. When somebody tells you about another person, another group, and they say, they are like this. Mexicans are rapists and drug dealers, for example. There's a gross and overt example. But we say more subtle things all the time. The narrations that we have of ourselves and others often bear very little resemblance to history, by the way. The guy that's done most of this work in Canada, Jocelyn Lichterneau, a Canada Research Chair at Laval, calls them mysteries. Right? He has done a whole bunch of work on how young Quebecers collectively, Francophone Quebecers collectively narrate the history of Quebec. And there's work around the world. Here's just a sample, a quote. I chose this quote on a new piece of work on Catalan students in Spain and how they narrate themselves in relation to school history. And they have a deep sense of what Catalan history is and what their place in the world is, and it has almost nothing to do with the history they learned in school or with academic history. But they've also narrated Spain. And if you don't think that has implications, Catalonia is just coming up on a referendum on independence. And again, I wouldn't presuppose suggesting an outcome to that referendum, but as an educator, I would want people to enter that knowledgeably. Now, we can't not narrate ourselves. We can't not do it. That's the way we are as people. We have a sense of ourselves temporally. What my past was, what my present is, and that often shapes how we think about the possibility of the future. In this work, for example, in Northern Ireland, there's a great kind of apathy around the Troubles. When they interview students about their history of Northern Ireland, Over and over again, you hear this narrative that people come along and they get close to solving the problem, and then something happens to disrupt it. It can't be solved. Now, if you're thinking about citizenship, that's pretty bleak. It has bleak implications for the future. But we know as teachers we have to engage those. So we can't not narrate ourselves, but we can be reflexive about it. We can think about it. We can think about, why do I hold this story about myself? And more importantly, why do I hold this story about the other? Well, I will talk a little bit about this. Just to get it in. We don't want to talk about religion in North America. We don't want to teach about it in the schools. We don't talk about it in the things. And how is it you teach about the social world? How is it you teach about diversity when most people in the world, religion is a defining force in your lives and you ignore it? We need to engage with this. It's by the way, in the curriculum. Curriculum allows you in New Brunswick to teach about religion. It allows you in every province in Canada and most states in the United States. There are lots of countries that do it really well in the world. You don't have to be religious, but if you want to be a citizen in the world today, you have to get religion. And I'm using this as a proxy, if you like, for other cultural things as well. All cultural expressions aren't religious, but we're afraid of this, and we have to be able to go there. And because we've been afraid of it, because we've adopted myths about the separation of church and state. By the way, you watch way too much American TV, if you believe that, because Canada has never had a legal principle of church and state. As some of my students discovered last week looking at the Constitution, God is mentioned in the Constitution. We have publicly funded Roman Catholic school boards in 3 provinces, for goodness sakes. We used to have them a lot more. You can't have separation of church and state when you do that. It's not a concept in Canada. Right? Maybe it should be part of the discussion, but you're not going to have it unless you can talk about religion. People have to know about it. They have to be able to talk about it. We have to work towards religious literacy. So culturally competent citizens, just to conclude, they see ethno-cultural diversity not as a problem to be solved, but as part of our civic context. They're reflectively self-aware. They know about their own position. They think about how their values and worldviews shape their part of the conversation. They avoid the big sort. We look for people who are different, people who think differently, to engage with. We understand history and how history works. As part of the conversation, we have to know our history, and we have to know how history works in terms of its framing of ourselves and other people. And finally, culturally competent citizens are religiously literate. I think if we're going to have a more dangerous and effective education for and about diversity, we need to pay attention to these things. Thank you very much.
Now you know why I love working with Alan Sears. He constantly keeps me thinking, keeps me awake at night thinking, oh, what have we done now in the BF program? What are we doing tomorrow? And every time I listen to him, I learn something new. So thank you so much. Oh, and I have our handy dandy little gift that we give to our colloquium speakers. We don't give them a baked check. But we do give them a poster to remember, and we really do appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Before we close, I have a few things to tell you about, and then we have a very short little closing video we want to share with you. Following the colloquium, there's a reception down the hall. I think it's room 225. It's the faculty lounge, and there's goodies there. Come and talk to Alan, come and talk to the others who are here. We have some other colloquiums coming up. The next one is on November 16th, a Wednesday night, and Professor Bill Randall from St. Thomas is going to speak about adult development and aging. He's a gerontologist scholar, and so that'll be very interesting, especially for those of us who are getting a little older, but also for all you very young people who will eventually get older. He's a really dynamic speaker, so do consider joining us. This week we have a lot of exciting events besides Convocation on Thursday. We're really pleased to have with us a scholar who's here from Albany, New York, Peter Johnson, who happens to be here this evening, to hear Ellen. Just a little wave, Peter. Peter's speaking to the BEd students on Wednesday afternoon, but he's also here giving a session downstairs in room 143 on Friday afternoon from 1:30 to 3:30. And he talks about the language of learning and how the way we speak, what we say, how we say it to students can either open their minds to learning or shut them down. And if you have a free afternoon on Friday afternoon and would like to join us, you're welcome to do that. There's no admission, and we have some extra seats available. If you're interested in young children reading, this coming Friday night, starting at 7 and all day Saturday, we have a conference on children's literature with 5 Canadian authors. Sherry Fitch will be here, Barbara Reed, Frida Wyszynski, Alan Syllaboy, and Sybil Young, plus 3 local authors who are school teachers who have written a little novel for grade 4 class, about the grade 4 level. And you can look online if you want to come and join us. But a particular interest, if you or anyone you know has young kids, Sherry Fitch is going to give free admission poetry presentation to children at 4 o'clock on the Saturday. There'll be popcorn and cotton candy. I don't know how healthy that is for them, but Sherry Fitch's reading will be very healthy for them. And it's again downstairs in room 143, so we hope you'll join us for some of those events. Each year we let Ottilia's daughters know that we're holding this event. And the youngest daughter is living in St. John. The second youngest daughter is at Queen's University on a big scholarship. 2 of the girls are in Halifax. One of them's doing her business degree. And the oldest daughter, whose original name is Praymore, we call her Missy, is out in Calgary. And she has sent along a short video that she has asked that we show. So I appreciate Catherine's going to start that for us. And following the video, we'll head on to the reception. Please join us there.
Hello everyone in Fredericton. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Missy, and I am the eldest daughter of the late Dr. Ottilia Chareka. I currently reside in Calgary, Alberta, and I truly wanted to be there with you, but I couldn't make the trip over. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and still send my well wishes and to thank you all for being present at the 5th annual lecture series that is named after my mother. I was extremely excited to find out that Dr. Alan Sears would be presenting at this lecture series. Now, I don't want to make the man feel old or anything, but I first met Alan when I was 3, 4, and now I'm in my late 20s, heading into my 30s. So it's fair to say the man has been around for a very long time. Alan was a huge champion of my mother, and it is fair to say that she would never have achieved the level of success that she did had it not been for him. When she faced financial challenges, when she questioned her own abilities, he was there supporting her, guiding her, and truly being an exceptional mentor and supervisor. I am so thankful for all of the work that he did with her. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Mom was a 3-time graduate of the University of New Brunswick Faculty of Education, and so this institution, this faculty, was very near and dear to her heart. It has now been 5 years since Mom died, and some days it feels like yesterday, other times it feels like longer. I truly struggled years ago and wondered where life would take my sisters and I. But I now find some peace, some comfort in knowing that despite the challenges that we went through, we were able to survive these past 5 years. There is no reason why we cannot survive the next 5 and the following 5, and so on. One thing that truly touches us is the fact that our mother's memory continues to live on. This memorial lecture series is just one example of that. And I am extremely thankful to everyone who has come together to put this lecture series on over the years, discussing topics around citizenship, education, social justice, all topics that my mother pursued during her academic career. I extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Ann Sherman, the Dean for the Faculty of Education, and I thank her as well for all of the things that she has done for my family and all that she did for my mother. Thank you so much for coming together. Thank you so much for remembering Mom. Thank you so much for reminding us of all of the wonderful things that she did, all of the wonderful things that she was capable of. It means the world. It means everything to myself and to my sisters. Good night.
Thank you again for coming. Please join us.